This episode is brought to you by Dogfish Head Craft Brewery. The Grateful Dead and Dogfish Head have gotten the band back together with the release of Grateful Dead Juicy Pale Ale, a light-bodied pale ale brewed with sustainable kernels of grains, granola, and heaps of good karma for a refreshing brew that's music to your taste buds. Available nationwide, visit dogfish.com to find Grateful Dead Juicy Pale Ale in your neck of the woods. Dogfish Head Craft Brewery is located in Milton, Delaware. Please drink responsibly.
No matter how you travel, it's good to have a plan. Some people plan every minute. No sleep, bus, museum, another museum, while others only plan to take it day by day. When it comes to your finances, a plan is just as important. You can count on Credit Karma to give you the insights you need to understand your options, so you can take charge of your financial path and find your way to money. Intuit Credit Karma. Karma you can count on. Download the app today.
Hello and welcome to episode 256, I had to think about that for a second, of Something About the Beatles podcast. And this is an interview, a conversation I had with Bill Schnee. Now, the name might not mean a ton to a lot of you, but if you've been paying close attention, going back to 1973, now 50 years ago, Ringo, the Ringo album, when that cover art was done a la Pepper with all the various celebrities, he is there on the cover. But not only that, but he gets a call out from Ringo himself for the very last song on the album, You and Me, Babe, the co-write with George and Mal Evans. The fade out of the song where he's calling out all the names, the credits, as it were, as the album is fading to black. You know exactly what I'm talking about. We talk about that on a show. But he was an engineer, mixer, producer through the years, starting in the late 1960s. And he's written a book talking about his career, Chairman at the Board. It is an unbelievable career he has had, starting out as a musician in LA despite his parents' wishes otherwise, and just sort of pivoting into this career armed with a great set of ears and with a technical skill set and electronic bent. He was the perfect guy with the perfect talent at the right time and place when such things were possible. And I cannot begin to list all the luminaries he has worked with through the years. An unbelievable run of hits and successful records that are part of our daily lives. But you'll hear at the end of this little setup here, I give you a taste of some of the records he's associated with as a engineer or mixer or producer. It's just unbelievable, like a soundtrack to your life, 70s, 80s. But you got to read the book because if you're interested in that kind of behind the scenes, how records are made, showbiz stories of various personas, it's unbelievable. It delivers, and he had such a ringside seat to the making of some unbelievable albums that are such a part of our lives. But for our purposes, for this conversation, he did get to work with all four ex-Beatles throughout the 70s, starting with Paul and Linda on Night Owl for Carly Simon's No Secrets album, and onto the Ringo album, and then followed by Goodnight, Vienna. And his perspectives, including doing some work at Apple Studios and the EMI facility now known as Abbey Road, are unbelievable. Just great, great stuff. And he's a super storyteller and self-deprecating guy. I could have talked all day with him. His stories bring you into the mix without over-exaggerating his own role or tearing down other people along the way unless warranted, and they tend to remain nameless. But anyway, a great, great read, and he's a great guy to have a conversation with. And I guess that was really how this book got started, was just stories he would tell through the years, people asking him about his career. Do check it out, and I hope you enjoy the conversation, because as we enter the 50th anniversary year of Ringo, I thought it'd be cool to shed some light with one of its creators to talk about how that near Beatle reunion went down. On the subject of great albums, I mentioned this once before in the show. I don't listen to a lot of other podcasts because I just haven't got the ear space for it. When I have my ears available, they tend to be working on this sort of thing. But I do recommend, do check out Jeremy Dillon's podcast, My Favorite Album. You know, it's very rare when somebody comes up with a great idea for something, and I think, God, why didn't I think of that? And I'm kicking myself. And somebody else beat me to it. Sometimes it'll happen with a book, very rarely. But he did it with this podcast of getting well-known personas. Some are actors, some are writers, some could be politicians. As people of celebrity to come and talk about, as when you tap into somebody's passion, they could talk endlessly about their favorite album. And it's a long-running show, my favorite album, hosted by Jeremy Dillon. This is top-notch. I wish I thought of it first, but on the other hand, nobody can do it better than Jeremy. It's amazing. The guests are stellar. They talk about every kind of record you can think of. I was thrilled to see that they discussed the Monkees in actually high-level serious tones on this podcast, so do check it out. My favorite album with Jeremy Dillon. And now on to the conversation with Bill Schnee. And yes, it's pronounced Schnee, even though it's spelled, apparently, pronounced Schnee. No, it's Schnee. And in fact, he talks in the book about how Boz Scaggs had a bunch of shirts printed up, riffing on the logo to the Alien film, only it says Schneelien, and got his face in there as well. Anyway, that's in the book. I don't think we talked about it, but here is a taste of Bill's work through the years. Let's start, for the sake of the listeners, with a bit about your background and how you entered the field of production, starting out as a musician, how that all panned out going back to the 60s.
My parents moved to Los Angeles for my senior year of high school, and I met some guys who were starting a band, and I'm kind of a jack of all, master of none musician, but keyboard was my, quote, main instrument. And so I asked them what they thought about having an organ in the group, and they said, why not? So we formed this band and started doing some demos, and we took our demos. One of the kids' parents knew someone who knew someone that was in the music business, and that someone was Gary Usher, a name that not very many people know, but he was friends with the Beach Boy Wilson family, and in fact really desired to be in the Beach Boys, and he didn't make it. But he did write two of the big Beach Boy hits with Brian, In My Room and 409. He got our demos and liked what he heard, called us up and asked for a meeting, and we went and met him in the Capitol Tower. And I was a huge Beach Boys fan, so I was really excited to go to Capitol Studios, then only to be kind of disappointed when he gave us a tour of the studios. And I said, is this the one Brian works in? And he said, no, he doesn't work here. He works across town at a place called Western. Oh, okay. But anyway, he liked what he heard and signed us to a contract. And a contract in those days was for 4 sides, as they call it, 4 songs that they would pay for. And they would release a couple of singles. And if you had a hit, you'd run in and cut 6 more to make the album. And the band was called the LA Teens. And suffice it to say, there never was an LA Teens album. We released a couple of singles. We charted, but in fact, our last single, my wife found a chart that has us ahead of the Beatles on some station. And now I'm sure ours was peaking at, I don't remember what it was, in the teens somewhere, and theirs was on their way to number 1 or 2 or something. But it still makes a nice chart. On those initial tracking session for the LA Teens, Gary Usher brought in a studio guitarist to augment the band. And his name was Richie Podler. And Richie was a phenomenal guitar player. Unfortunately, I'm saying was because he passed away last year. He was a phenomenal guitar player, but it also turned out, as I later learned, he was a phenomenal engineer and producer. Well, when we got dropped, he had told us about his studio, which he had built, and went over to his studio and told him the sad news. And he said, oh, you guys were great. Listen, I can get you a deal. I know this guy, Mike Curb. You should go see him. He's going to go places. And so he was right about that too. So we made a second record deal with Mike Curb, with Richie to produce us. For Decca, we had recorded at the Capitol Studios, and even on what became the first single, I even worked in Western Studio 3, which was the room that Brian Wilson did a lion's share of his work in. And you can imagine how nervous a 17-year-old kid was going into that studio and sitting down at that organ to try to do a solo. But
This was 1965, 66?
We were signed in 64, so it was early 65.
Okay.
So we go now to Richie's studio, American Recording, and it's a lot funkier than those great places in Hollywood. So we go in and we put down the first track, and I came into the control room. He hit play on the Ampex 4-track, and the sound that came out of the speakers, as I sat there looking up at the speakers as I was listening to our take, I was just completely blown away. I was getting an emotional content that I never got at those other great studios out of the band. It's the same drummer, the same bass player, me. What's going on? And I just figured right away, as funky as the place was compared to those slicker looking places, it had to be either the equipment or the guy behind the board. But at that moment, as soon as this tape stopped, I pointed at all the equipment and said to Richie, "Can you teach me how to do this?" And he went, No, I'm teaching this guy here, Bill Cooper. Go out and do another take, please." And that we did. But that was that aha moment, as I've called it, where it set in course the rest of my life.
That is an amazing thing, that this homemade ramshackle studio would sound better than these pro studios that you'd already been in.
Right. Well, and it's so interesting because, as I said, he was a great engineer. And something I've always ascribed to is it isn't the equipment, it's who's operating the equipment. Mm-hmm. And you can have the greatest equipment with a mediocre engineer, or you can have some mediocre equipment with a great engineer. And I'm betting on the latter most of the time. And as it turns out, he had a lot of things, as I would much later learn, which helped me to build my own studio. He had a lot of things covered that they didn't have. First of all, it was interesting. He had one of the first, it was homemade, but it was one of the very first transistor consoles. Those other studios at that time were still using tube consoles. Now, believe me, that I love tubes. My whole system, we built our console for my studio, we had tube output. We had 24 tube mic preamps out in the studio. Believe me, it's not that the transistors made it better than the tube consoles at Capitol and Western. It's just that it was a great sounding console for the time. And he had really incredible acoustics in the room, which I would once again later learn were extremely important for getting a good sound, and was the basis of the reason that I built a studio in the first place. When I built the studio in 1980, I went to the architect and said, "Look, the only reason I'm building a studio is to get a room with a sound like the ones in the 60s were," because I grew up in the industry in the 70s. And by then, all the studios that were built so that leakage, the sound of one instrument getting into another instrument's microphone, didn't exist, because now they had this wonderful first 8-track and then 16-track. And the whole saleability of that in the beginning was the fact that we can affect things completely later on. When we remix now, we can change the arrangement. And of course, the example I always give is the guy that tries 8-track out for the first time and complaining about the extra tape cost because it's 1-inch tape instead of 1/2-inch. And he's been sold the bill of goods that, we can even change the arrangement when we mix it. So he does his sessions and his overdubs, and he goes to the mix and he's listening to the mix and he says to the engineer, "Sounds good. Why don't we see what it sounds like taking the piano out of the intro, just the guitar hat and bass?" And so he turns down the rotary fader and the producer says, "I still hear the drums." And he said, "Oh yeah, that's the spill in the piano." "Oh, so we can't really get rid of the drums in the intro." "Well, not completely, but don't worry, that'll never happen again. And the next time there's blankets on the piano and so on." Well, that's what led to building rooms that were dead boxes so that one instrument's sound wouldn't get across the room to the other instrument. The unfortunate part of that, as I learned, is that even the microphones on that instrument don't sound that good. On something like a guitar, it doesn't make that much difference. But especially drums and more acoustic instruments, they want air around them. And so you don't get that in a dead room. So anyway, so Richie had a lot of things right. He was ahead of the curve, way ahead of the curve. Unfortunately, Richie got in a fight with Mike Curb, and that was the end of our recording for a while. And I went off and found a little studio where I was living with my parents and the outskirts of LA, and came in and asked the guy, "I'll help you with sessions and sweep the floor, do whatever you need if you'll let me learn this equipment and play with my band when there's no one here." And that's where it started for me. It might have ended there if it weren't for the fact that he thought within 6 months, he heard what I did with my band, and the owner thought that I was better than he was, which is probably true. Which also might not have been saying that much, but whatever. And he comes in one day with a homemade 4-track, because we were 2-track. It was just nothing but 2-track. You had to balance everything. They came, they played and sang, and they walked out. And when I say this was a Mickey Mouse studio, there was only a 2-channel mixer with no EQ, no tone controls. And it did have a reverb control, and we had a spring reverb, like from a guitar amp for reverb. two condenser mic, only two of the best professional microphones, only two, and so on. Egg cartons on the wall for sound absorption, for creating the sound. But when he came in with the 4-track, I said, how are we going to do 4-track with this 2-channel mixer? And he said, with this. And he pulled out another 2-channel mixer. And at that point, since I was doing almost all of the sessions, I said, no, we're going to have to get a console of some kind. So he did some research and came up with a guy in San Diego that he had heard that was good with electronics. His name was Toby Foster. He came up and with the paltry budget that he was given said, I can build you something that's going to look nice. It'll have some colored lights and it won't be as quiet. I can't use professional equipment at that money. I'll use some of the PA stuff, but it'll sound good. And that's what happened, and it did. The reason that was so important is that Toby ended up moving up to LA from San Diego and getting a job in a studio called Whitney at Glendale at the time. And I spent 2.5 years chasing the LA teens with those 2 record deals. And finally, under pressure of my parents, I went back to college. But every day after school, I would drive from where we lived to about a 45, 50-minute drive to Glendale to ask Toby as many questions as he would let me. He was very patient, and it was great because I could say, what's a dynamic mic? What's a condenser mic? What ribbon mic? I forgot how those relate to each other, that kind of thing. And he would just take question after question between his work schedule, what he was doing at the studio, which was mostly maintenance and cutting lacquers for albums. I'd get as many questions as I could in until he couldn't take it anymore. And he'd say, all right, go home. I'll see you tomorrow. But that's where my education, when I introduce him, we're still very, very good friends. And when I introduce him, I always say, this guy taught me everything I know because he really did teach me all of the basics.
It's amazing. So at what point did you make the commitment fully to being the guy behind the board and not a member of a band chasing a record deal?
Well, like I said, the band broke up after the second record deal. We lost our drummer. His parents said, no, you can't chase this anymore. You got to go to school. I was under heavy pressure from my dad, who was a doctor and really wanted me to be a doctor. He was very much against me doing music as a career. In fact, if I jump ahead several years, when my career started opening up, I had a couple of Grammy nominations and maybe 6 or 8 gold records, something like that. And he literally sat me down and said, when are you going to get a real job, Bill? And I said, Dad, this is my job. I really love what I do. And I think I'm good at it. And it didn't make sense to him.
Wow.
Which is kind of unfortunate. And as the joke goes, if I ever go to a psychiatrist, that will be the first day. Well, we'll start with that. Never getting the acceptance of your father.
Was there a point where he finally accepted that this was a job for real?
Yes, I think he did. There was never another conversation about it. Let's put it that way. But
okay.
But if the success I had at that point didn't speak to him, I don't know what to say.
Okay.
He was an old school guy from Austria, self-made, self-taught, worked his way up to become a doctor through tough times and whatnot. And he loved music, not our music, but he loved music. But he said, it's a great thing for a hobby, but, it's very risky as a career. And of course, he was 100% correct. Can't argue with that. But to answer your question, all of my aptitude in school was in math and science. In fact, my first day in college, I enrolled in aerospace engineering. That's what I had in mind. But by the time 2.5 years go by and I'm ready to go back to school, my dad said, I don't know what to do because I don't think I want to do aerospace anymore. He said, well, get a business degree. You can always use business degree. So that's what I did. Well, because of my aptitude being on a scientific basis and my creative side, where my left brain and right brain meet in the middle, allowed me to learn engineering incredibly well, incredibly quickly. Between that and then the experience that I would get in the next couple of years, I ended up going back to Richie Podler. And after 2 months of begging, he had lost his other engineer. After 2 months of begging, he finally threw me in on a demo session to see if I could do it. And I did well. And I called him that day and said, well, what did the client say? He said, they said, you did great. I said, see, I told you, I know I can do this. You got to understand, by then he had the hottest rock studio in LA. It was about 3 years, a little less than 3 years earlier. I didn't know the difference between an equalizer and a limiter. And now I'm asking to engineer in this studio. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That's for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But I got through the first test. So he said, well, come and do a second one. There's a demo tomorrow morning. And so I came in and did publishing demo. That's 3 hours where a 4-piece band would come in, record 2 or 3 songs. They'd put vocals down, you'd mix them, and they'd go off to make acetates to send to artists to see if they would record their songs from big publishing companies. That's how they worked back then. And the second, I called him up after that and I said, well, what did they say? And they said, you were great too. I said, well, what's next? He said, okay, come tomorrow night and record 3 Dog Night. I said, okay, huh? Wait, what? And the reason being is that 3 Dog Night had already had a hit. They were working on their second album, on their way to being one of the biggest bands in the country. And talk about not making any sense, he wasn't producing them. He would go on to produce the lion's share of their records from the third album on. But he had only engineered the first one and was in the middle of engineering the second one. That producer at the time was a guy named Gabriel Meckler, who also produced another big band that Ritchie had done the first 2 albums on, Steppenwolf. Biggest client. And he's turning it over to a kid. I mean, if I had fallen on my face and embarrassed myself, how embarrassing would it have been to him? Gabriel could have been frustrated and walked out and never come back. But I did manage to swim once again. The next day, I said, what now? And he said, come back tonight, do it again. So I went the second night and cut a second track. Same thing, come again. Third night, I got in trouble. Mike Alsip, the guitar player. It's amazing I can remember that guy's name from back then, 1969. The guitar player in the band wanted an effect that I didn't have any idea how to get. And Ritchie, being, as I mentioned, the incredible guitar player that he was, had probably done a lot of that kind of stuff for Mike on the guitar, helped him with those kind of things. So I had to call Ritchie, and he came down, and that was the end of my tracking with the band. But I did do overdubs with him, and I also stayed there and watched, ran the tape machine, and learned as much as I possibly could on every session, watching this absolute master do his deed. And that's really what turned it around for me, because I started working with really good people for the first time, really great musicians. It was also the end of my hopes of doing anything professional with my piano playing, because I worked with so many unbelievable players that I'm never going to get there. But as you said earlier, it worked out all right.
Right. That's amazing. What a story. Now, tracks that you produced ended up on their second album?
Yeah. 2 of the tracks, I only engineered them. Like I said, Gabriel Meckler was the producer. Mm-hmm. To the extent that, you know what, that's the point in history when the engineer was starting to become much more important. Mm-hmm. Because the sounds that were being put together, it was as if the studio had become an extra set of paints and brushes that helped create the record in a major way. Before that, in like the Sinatra and whatever era, it was an arranger that orchestrated everything, and the engineer just captured what the arranger had written. I'm simplifying it, but it holds true for the most part. He was just capturing a performance. But now you were helping to make the sonic aspects of the performance a part of it. And at that point in time, sounds and tricks and all that kind of stuff were coming in, because that would help to make hits, because people had never heard something like back it up a little bit, like a distorted guitar or whatever. So that was, again, where the engineers started becoming very important.
On that subject, and you're working on the 3 Dog Night album, and beyond the tracks that you engineered, you're observing. Was there a distinction in their approach between the songs that they knew were destined to be singles and the ones that were album tracks? Did they approach them differently?
I would say not really. They paid incredible attention to, especially that album. I'm not sure that anyone knew what was going to be a hit and what wasn't.
So basically, they approached everything like it was a potential single.
Yeah. I would say that there were definite songs where they knew it probably wouldn't be a single, but they didn't put any less effort into it. That's the best way to put it.
And slag something off as well. This is just an experiment. No one's going to hear it on the radio, kind of thing.
Right. No. Even though the record company would be blamed for that over and over. There's only 2 great tracks on an album. Why spend that much money, kind of thing?
Right.
I think that was more due to producers and artists that weren't incredible, because I don't think anyone tried to do that.
It's interesting to me how much a lot of what you're saying harkens back to the Beatles in one way or another, starting with your father's advising you to get out and take a real job. You're probably familiar with the quote from John's Aunt Mimi, who raised him. A guitar is all right, John, but you'll never earn your living from it. And one day he got her a plaque with that inscribed on it when Beatlemania hit. Right. And just their own disappointment with buying albums by artists that they admired to discover that it was the 2 hit songs or whatever, and the rest of it was crap. And therefore, they deemed everything they did an approach as though it could be a hit. So it's interesting to hear you, as somebody working in this field, describing it from your end of things.
Well, we were just making the turnaround at the end of the 60s, the LA Teens. I dare say we spent whatever time we spent on the 4 songs that we did that were each one potentially a single. But if there'd been a hit, yeah, you had to move fast if you wanted to sell albums. So you literally ran in and hurriedly made the other 6 songs. So that could easily happen back then.
Sure. So now we're at the end of the 60s. And at what point did you start working with Richard Perry?
What happened was Richie took over producing those 2 acts, Three Dog Night and Steppenwolf. And at that point, the next record, now he was a big time producer because he was producing 2 hit acts. So he started getting all kinds of offers. And I only wanted to produce, really. So I went to him and I said, look, why don't you close the studio, make it a production house, you get a new act. If I like it, I'll go and work with him. You'll take a piece off the top and kind of walk me through it and get my career going. And he thought that was a tremendous idea. So he closed the studio and gave me the first act. I cut 1 track with The Realm, 1 track, and Richie decided he had a new Steppenwolf album to do. And in those days, we were used to doing the setup. There'd be, for instance, a day session and a night session. And you would set up for the day session and then tear it down, and the engineer would set up for the night session kind of thing. He decided he didn't want to tear down. He wanted to leave it up. Well, that meant that Mr. Bill here couldn't get in the studio to do any work. And I wasn't paid unless I was doing work from his production company. So after about 4 weeks of that, I had gotten used to paying rent and eating back then. And so I thought that I better do something. With his permission, I called all the clients that I had worked with and told them that I was leaving and that I would love to work with them. One of those clients was a guy named Joel Sill. He and Steve Barry worked together at ABC Records. And at American, I had worked with them on a group called Smith. They had a top 5 hit with the Bacharach song, Baby It's You, really good version of that song, rock version. So I went out and I'm independent. I left out one little part here. When I started at American, I was still getting so much pressure from my dad that I wasn't going to ever be a doctor. But I said, okay, what about this? I found out about the 3 and 3 for law school, which is if you have 3 years of college and you have good enough grades and you do well on the LSAT, you can get into any law school in the country. So I took the LSAT, I did pretty well, and I started law school while I'm working at Podler's. I got through the first semester, got the grades, started the second semester, got the grades. They were all C's, maybe 1 B. And I knew I was faking it because I didn't have time to do the reading, go to classes and sessions. And so I decided I quit college for 2.5 years chasing music. I can quit for 1.5 years, chase this music one more time. If it doesn't work, I'll go back and get the law degree and maybe try again, maybe not, who knows. So over a year went by and it was getting time. It was coming right up when I had to register for the fall semester again. And I was in a studio mixing by myself one day, and the girl up front buzzes in on the intercom and says, Bill, Clive Davis is on the phone for you. I went, Clive Davis? Picked up the phone. Hello? Hi, Bill, Clive Davis. How are you today? I'm fine. What do you want to do with your, Joel tells me, Joel Sill, Joel tells me that you're a very talented musician and engineer. Oh, thank you. What do you want to do with your life? I said, well, I think I'm going to go to law school and then try. No. He interrupted me. No, you don't want to go to law school. I went to law school. If you've got music in your blood, you know that's what you want to do. And I said, yes, that is what I want to do. And essentially, Clive took the butt out and gave me a shot. So I had to join the union because CBS studios were union back then. And the first act I did was a rock act called Sweat Hog. Managed to get a hit, not a big hit, but top 30, I think, with the first single. So now I was off and flying. So then he gave me Blood, Sweat, and Tears, but it was after David Clayton Thomas had left the band. So I went to New York and cut some tracks with them. We set up time for vocals with the new singer. New singer didn't show up. Turned out he was an alcoholic and went on a binge. So they had to find a new singer. So I came back to LA. He gave me White Trash without Edgar Winter, which I thought was okay because the great singer in White Trash was this Southern boy, Jerry LaCroix. But Things didn't go well. People in his band weren't happy. He didn't like the songs. He only wrote 2 songs on the White Trash album, previous one that he wrote with Edgar. I didn't like the songs that he wrote. He didn't like the songs that I brought him. Things weren't going well. And one of the guys in the band was bound and determined to take it over. So I just walked away, told Clive what was going on. Well, they had the craziest thing at CBS in those years. They had 3 studios, 3 mix rooms, 2 mastering rooms, and 1 assistant engineer. What? Yeah, 1. Why? How? Because if you weren't booked to record or mix as a first engineer, you were a second, which was a really ridiculous way to do things, because literally one day you could be recording some major act and the next day you could be assisting on a demo. But they had to put me to work since I wasn't doing any of my own productions now. So they threw me in on a Richard Perry session doing Barbra Streisand as an assistant. And about 6, 7, 8 days into that, for some reason, I couldn't be happier, Richard said, I want Bill to engineer instead of the guy that was doing it. So I took over the first chair and started working with Richard, and that's how it all got started. You want me to keep going on Richard? That's easy.
Describe Richard for listeners. I think people that listen to the show know him, obviously, for the 2 albums he produced with Ringo, but also the Harry Nilsson records he produced. And for a time in the 70s, he was just on an incredible roll. Carly Simon, Barbra Streisand. He had, in the late 60s, done the Tiny Tim album, as well as the Fats Domino stuff, where he's doing Beatle covers, including Lady Madonna. An amazing career. He goes on to form Planet Records by the end of the decade, and you couldn't be hotter than him, measured in terms of millions of records sold, than he was in the 70s. And you're right next to him for a lot of that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you said it all. It wasn't 100% assured, but it was darn good insurance on having a record. We did a really good record with Martha Reeves from Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, and that never got to first base, unfortunately. So they weren't always hits, but the Streisand record, he was on the second one with her, and from there he went to England to do Harry Nilsson. He had been intrigued with the studio, Trident Studios, and the engineers that had worked on the early Elton albums. And it was there working with Harry, who had met Ringo, been in England a lot, living there even, and he introduced Ringo to Richard, and they talked about someday they should make a record together. And then he went back after the first Harry record, and he did No Secrets, the You're So Vain album with Carly. And what's so funny about it for me is that because he knew me, that I had come from American and the rock records that I had done and whatnot, and he thought of me as a, quote, rock guy. So he called me from England and he said, I'm doing the last mix on this album with the exceptions, there's 2 rock songs. I'm coming back to LA. I want you to mix those. I said, okay, that'll be great. So he came back and I mixed the 2, quote, rock songs. And then Richard loves options. So he said, well, why don't you try a mix on this one? And I said, okay. And I did, and he liked it. And I ended up remixing the whole album. That was the introduction to Richard.
Were you in the studio for any of the tracking of that album?
No, everything was done in England.
Okay. Because I know Klaus is on that album as well.
Right. I think he actually met Klaus with Harry's record also.
Mm-hmm.
And then one day Richard calls up and says, I'm going to do an album with Ringo. I want you to do it with me. And I said, okay, that sounds great. And, you know, when memories are this long ago, obviously, unfortunately, there's not enough of them, but some of them that stick out, the one that really sticks out was me setting up on Sunday night, going in to put the microphones up for the band the next day. And you walk into the studio and here's a drum setup. And of course, the drum cases all say the Beatles, Ringo. And I'm thinking, you know, this may not be the drum set, probably wasn't the drum set that he used on Beatle records. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I don't know. It didn't much matter. That was Ringo's drums. And Ringo was going to plop his little bottom down on that and start playing in the morning. So some combination of excitement and nerves was running through my body. So the next day we cut the first song.
Do you remember what the first song was you worked on for the Ringo album?
I don't think I can right now. I have to say, when I wrote the book, I couldn't have written the book without the internet because the memory is fading. But when you start looking at all kinds of things and, you know, reading things and all, then it sparks it and then it starts coming back. It's great that way. It was great that way.
Accessing studio logs and such.
Yeah, exactly. And then the next day, George Harrison shows up. He's come over. He's heard what Ringo's doing and he shows up and he heard what we had done and he really liked it. And so he joined in and now I was recording 2 Beatles from then on. And he brought up a song that he had produced on Ringo called Photograph. And he never finished it. He did it in England with Ringo. This is George. And it was a really good song. And it's, as many of your listeners probably know, it's the forlorn guy that has lost his love and all he has is a photograph. And George's version was a little too forlorn. At least that's what Richard convinced Ringo of. And I think he was right. And so I said, well, why don't we give that a go? And so we did it. And I think it was Richard's idea to take it down a Phil Spector road, which is what we did, which even included getting Phil's arranger to do the strings and flutes and the choir in it.
Did you guys record it in mono too?
We didn't have enough tracks to do much else, yes. In fact, what we ended up doing, actually, the whole idea of synchronizing tape machines was unheard of in the music business in that year. But film had already gone to it. So we were in a film lot, Warner Brothers, scoring stage, and we actually did record it on another machine in sync with our machine. But we couldn't mix that anywhere, so that had to be mixed down onto whatever few tracks we had. So that's how it went. At the end of the week, we'd had a pretty darn good week. And as we're leaving, Richard said, oh, by the way, on Monday, John Lennon will be here also. I went, what? 3 Beatles? And he said, yep, John has a song for him. And that song was I'm the Greatest, a song that John had actually written after the Beatle breakup about himself, which he readjusted the lyrics to fit Ringo. And now I mentioned setting up the drums that there was a mixture of excitement and nervousness. Monday morning, there was no excitement. I was nothing but nerves because in come 3 Beatles. And, and I had met some other famous people that played on that first record and whatnot, but they weren't John Lennon, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Let's take a second here. To this point, obviously, you are innately musical, and so much so that you're an aspiring musician, and then you take your engineering brain and you get into the production side of things and excel at it right from the get-go. But I have to think at some point, you described you were a Beach Boys fan pretty early on. Were you also a Beatles fan? Was that like inescapable? If you like music, you had to like the Beatles? Or what was your take, and how did that rock your world, or didn't it, when that happened?
Well, to tell you the truth, I love the Beach Boys. I love the harmonies. I've always loved vocal harmonies. And what Brian came up with was phenomenal for me. And so much so that in the beginning, sure, I loved the Beatles. But if I had to pick one in the beginning, it would have been the Beach Boys. Now, unfortunately, and it might have stayed the Beach Boys if Brian hadn't had the unfortunate problems that he had with life and gone off the rails. Mm-hmm. And what can you say?
Do you remember what you thought about Pet Sounds when that came out?
Oh, I went out of my mind. Yeah.
And Good Vibrations as well?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Come on. And so did they, of course.
Right.
You've certainly heard plenty of stories from them about what they thought of that.
Uh-huh.
If there wasn't a Pet Sounds, there might not have been a Sgt. Pepper.
Right.
But now I was definitely taken with the English sound. The LA Teens were actually an amalgam of the Beach Boys and the British Invasion, to tell you the truth, if you listen to all the singles. So I was definitely into all of that as well. But you really had to fall in love with the Beatles. The energy especially, that was one of the big things for me that was just unheard of. What's that great story? I don't know the numbers, but the day before they were on Ed Sullivan, 12,000 guitars were sold in the country. The day after, there were 200,000 sold.
Sure.
Whatever the numbers were, the point's well taken.
Right. So upon meeting first 1, then 2, and 3 Beatles, you were stoked, just knowing what they'd done and having especially attuned ears, undoubtedly, from listening to their albums in the 1960s.
And especially at that point, what I saw was here's the thing. Ringo, we started the album with Ringo alone. And Ringo is, everyone's seen him. What you see is what you get. He's just jovial and as jolly a fellow as you'd ever want to meet. George got there, and the quiet one wasn't so quiet. Now, of course, Lennon and McCartney weren't there. That might have had a great deal to do with that. And he was quite lovely, a guy. And when we started working on Photograph, Ringo kind of took a little bit of a back seat, and most of the interplay was between George and Richard Perry. But now on Monday with John Lennon, it was a completely different thing. The other 2 Beatles were just literally focused on John, and it was whatever John wanted. He ran the show, and you knew early on that when he knew we had a take, that was going to be the take. And indeed it was.
Were you there for the run-through session where he's doing the lead vocal?
Yeah, that was really funny to bring that up because that's from me, I guess, indirectly or directly. What am I kidding? Because when we got to the place, I think that record was 16 track. And so he had a vocal on there. He had put a vocal down to show Ringo how it goes so he could learn it. And after Ringo had learned it, and we were doing some musical overdub, we needed that track. So I had the presence of mind before I erased it to throw down the rough mix that I had up on the board with John's voice.
Wow.
And I didn't tell Richard, I didn't tell anyone, and I just put it away. And then I think I did send it to Richard finally, like not even 20 years later, maybe 15 years later. But when they did that anthology of Lennon after he died, they called me for some advice on different things. And I said, you know what I got for you? I said, I got something for you guys. And I sent it to them. So it ended up on that anthology record.
Wow, that's amazing. Well done. Fantastic.
Yeah, just lucky that I had the presence of mind to do that under the nerve-wracking condition. I have to tell you that at that point in time, I'd worked with a lot of very good, very creative people. I'd never seen anyone like John Lennon. First of all, I think fast, I move fast. For me, creativity comes, I can't stand the slow, monotonous plodding through something. It's the reason, you may know, I recorded Asia, Steely Dan's album. They asked me to mix it. I said, I don't think I could mix with you guys. And they said, well, you'll try, won't you? And I said, yeah. We went in one day, and at the end of the day, we shook hands, and I said, guys, you got a phenomenal album, but my style just doesn't work with the way you guys work, but go get them. And they did. So Lennon, he shoots from the hip, and he shoots fast. And it's like, da, 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 da. Well, let's see if that works. No, that didn't work. Well, how about this? Blah, 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 da, da. And it was great following him around. And so much of what he said, it was astounding. He would open his mouth. He could be sitting in front of the console where we were playing something. I can't remember what song, but I remember he just happened to sing out loud a background part. Set up a vocal mic, quick. Got the vocal mic, go out and do that and come out while you got it. And because Richard knew, a lot of times, super creative sessions, it happens, grab it. We may never fly this way again, so let's get it while it's hot.
Sure.
Kind of thing.
Did you get a sense of how Richard was reacting to him? Richard, who's worked with everybody to this point, but not John Lennon?
Yeah, he was blown away like I was. Richard likes to be the more methodical and moves a little slower, but he had no problem adjusting to John. Like I said, he saw, like all of us saw, that John was going to run the show and whatnot. I may as well insert at this point the greatest or saddest, I'm not sure which, part of that whole story. The way I looked at this album was his lads all knew that their solo careers were going to do fine. But Mr. Starkey, not being the prolific songwriter, at least, that the others were, he might need a leg up. And so they all jumped in to do that. And as it turns out, Mr. McCartney was contacted by Ringo, and he said, sure, Linda and I would love to write you a song. Now, at that point in time, Mr. McCartney had a drug bust and was not allowed in the country, in the United States. Isn't it interesting to think about the fact that if that wasn't the case, he and Linda might well have jumped on a plane, hopped over to Los Angeles, and walked in, and there could have been a Beatle reunion. I'll tell you what, the press certainly thought that something might be happening, because after that Monday with Lennon, from then on, every single day, there were those vans, news vans, in the parking lot of the studio, hoping to get a look of whoever came in. But it's really fun to think about what might have been.
And then you had Klaus on the session as well as Billy Preston.
Right.
So you had like the second tier Beatles all accounted for.
Exactly. And not because I did it, honestly, but because of what that album is. And what is it? First of all, I think it's a great album. It is the only time three Beatles ever played together after the breakup, since the breakup or after the breakup. That would never happen again. It has, as you just pointed out, two very important people in the life of the Beatles on it as well. And it did okay, but I still don't think that it ever got what it deserved. And again, not because I had anything to do with it.
No, I think certainly in Ringo's story, it looms large. I think at the time it made it to number 2, but Goodbye Yellow Brick Road was number 1, and that's not going to be denied. So a little bit of timing off, but just to have 2 number 1 U.S. hit singles spawned from it, which is something no other ex-Beatle had achieved at that point. It speaks volumes about the work you guys did and the unbelievably shrewd production approach Richard Perry had in giving a guy this support who is not a singer in the traditional sense.
Right.
He's a personality. And that's what you guys built around him, was something where that Ringoism is allowed to shine with this wonderful cast of supporting players, the band and Mark Bolan and other people that made it to that album, all turning out to give a little help to their friend. It's just amazing.
Absolutely.
You described the LA sessions, and that involved the recording of I'm the Greatest and Photograph and Sunshine Life for Me. Did that take place in LA? It must have, right? With the band?
Yeah. Everything took place in LA except for the McCartney's tune. There were two of them.
Right.
Yeah. For that one, we had to go to England. And I can't say enough. John on that album, that was the only thing. John played very small. He played, that was really all he did was that song on the first Ringo album. On the next album, he had a bigger part. Mm-hmm. But we went to England to do the McCartney tune. And when we got there, Paul was doing a video for his band and invited us to the film studio.
The shoot you're talking about was the James Paul McCartney TV special, and it was the Big Barn Bed shoot that opens it.
Yes, which was hysterical. That was the first time I think that had been done on a video where the audience was made up of TV sets with people in it. I don't know, 50, 70 TV sets with people as if they were an audience when the camera panned over there. Mm-hmm. John was a man of few words, not very warm. I wouldn't say that he was very warm. On the second album, when we spent a little more time, it was a little better, but he's not like warm and fuzzy. And then there's Paul McCartney and Linda, who could not have been nicer. I mean, they welcomed us in and just anything you need, anything you want, and just were so amazing to us.
So when you get there to actually do the production on the two tracks, the one that he wrote for Ringo, 6 o'clock, and the other ended up being You're 16. First, do you know how You're 16 got brought into the mix, whose idea it was to cover that tune?
You're 16, I don't remember. That's now that I think about it, that's Richard. That's probably Richard. Richard was very good with songs, matching songs with artists. And that definitely feels like Richard to me.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And what a choice.
Yeah. Now that was recorded in LA. The only thing that we did a couple of overdubs, including the mouth sax that Paul did.
Right. That everybody thinks is a kazoo.
Right. That Richard, it was so funny. We're going over there. And in those days, analog tapes are not very light and you can't check them. You would never check an analog tape in the airplane. You carried them on board with you. And here I had to schlep those things. He went, I want you to bring all the masters. I went, why? Because anything that Paul wants to do, I'm going to let him do. And so unfortunately, that's the only thing he did. But
did he get to hear the works in progress at all?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
I think we played him almost everything to see if he heard anything.
So he could have been on I'm the Greatest if he saw an opening for himself.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Wow. Very interesting. He elected not to touch that one.
Yeah. When I tell the story of there could have been a Beatle reunion, I've always said, I think most of the bad blood had kind of dried up, by then. I'd like to think so, but maybe it hadn't. Who knows? I don't know. On the other hand, I'm the Greatest. I mean, it was pretty full the way Lennon did it, pretty simple and basic and raw. So maybe he did hear it and said, oh, boy, that sounds great.
So for the tracking of 6 o'clock, that was done at Apple Studio?
Yeah, that was at Apple. Ringo called. There was a new band that was in the studio working. Ringo called from the States before we left and said, I need a week to do a song with Paul. Can you guys take a week off? And of course, what were they going to say? Mm-hmm. Sure, we'll take a week off. So we went there and recorded. That was in 3 Savile Row, which is where their offices were, which is where they played the rooftop concert.
Right.
And
did you watch Get Back, by the way?
Yes.
Did you have any particular perceptions of that going into it? Like you must have seen Let It Be back in the day, right?
Right. A great deal of that because Glenn Johns, that did a lot of work on that, has become a very good friend of mine over the years. But yeah, in fact, I said yes, but I still need to finish the 3rd episode. Mm-hmm. But I was not so enamored with the studio, to be honest. I wasn't too thrilled.
I was wondering about that, what your take as a professional was, because the whole thing seemed sort of ad hoc, especially after they had a sort of reconstructed after letting Magic Alex work his magic on it.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't make sense to me. You would have hoped that they would have done something really, really special, and it just wasn't, for lack of a better word. But once again, memories that stick with you for life. when we got the track, Paul came in, was sitting there listening. And when it ended, he turned to me and he said, "Nice one, Bill."
Nice.
That's all that mattered.
Now, on that track, a question I think a lot of listeners would be wondering about is we've known as hardcore fans that there's the take that's on the record, and then there's the extended coda where it gets counted back in and they jam a little bit for another minute. And that's come out now as a bonus track on the CD. Do you have any insights into that, how the decision was made to lop that ending off, or it was made at the time to leave that off? Because apparently it made it onto the 8-track and promo copies in 73.
Oh, you mean the home 8-track?
Yeah, the home 8-track, that the extended version of 6 o'clock, which wasn't intended for general release, snuck out. Right. But eventually it did get out in general release in the 90s as part of the bonus tracks.
Yeah, I mean, maybe if I didn't realize that, if I did, I've forgotten about the 8-track, but I think it was because we were fighting length. on the LP, you were always
purely running time.
Yeah. And that was an extra, whatever it is, minute and something, I think, of time that we couldn't afford. So that was the reason for lobbing it off. Whereas on tape, of course, you could do as long as you wanted.
Right. Now, were you present when Paul laid down the mouth sax part?
Yes.
Okay. Can you describe that to listeners exactly how that went down? It was a serendipitous thing, right? It was not like planned that was what he was going to do.
Right. Basically. I mean, he was trying different ideas for a solo. And it sort of, as I remember it sort of started with him kind of going, just kind of doing a melody like that. And somewhere in there, I decided, get up on the mic if you would. And then I purposely overdrove the mic preamp, something the Beatles did quite a bit.
Sure.
I purposely drove it into distortion on purpose, and it got that kind of that kazoo-esque sound.
Yeah, that buzziness.
And everyone seemed to like it, so we went with it. We got a performance of it and went with it.
Fantastic.
So when we were done, we weren't. Meaning we did our week at the studio, and we needed one more day for, of all things, synth solo that Paul was going to play on. And Ringo could easily have called the band and said, "Guys, I'm sorry, I just need one more day." But he chose not to do that. Instead, he chose to go back to EMI Studios. That would be Studio 2, where they did the lion's share of their work, the Beatles' work, and do it there. Now, at that time, you could not have independent engineers. They had to be a company engineer. So they threw us in with this little-known gentleman named Alan Parsons to engineer the session. That was the first time I met Alan. Wasn't the last. And so I went in and said hello to everybody. They were getting set up. And I went, of course, walked down the staircase into the hallowed ground of Studio 2, and just, like, I think anybody that's a Beatles fan would be there and just think about, oh my gosh, what went on in this place? Just unbelievable.
That was your first time.
Yeah. And so then I went back and sat in the back of the room for the rest of the session. About an hour into it, Ringo showed up. I had asked him, I said, "Ring, you could do me a real big solid if, while I'm here, if you could get me British copies of your guys' albums," which, as I'm sure all of your diehard fans know, the Beatles thought the American versions were inferior, not just because they were mastered from a tape copy, which loses something, but just the way the Capitol engineer handled it compared to the way they handled it at EMI. And so he said, "Oh, gladly, Bill, gladly." So he walks in, sits down next to me with a stack of Beatle albums in the control room of the studio where most of that was done. And I said, "Oh, so much." And Ringo, he starts apologizing. "Oh, they didn't have I can't remember which one. They didn't have such and such and such. I'm really sorry. I'll get it to you though." That's okay. That's okay. Please. This is fabulous. Including some of the British singles with the artwork and stuff that went with them.
Oh, wow.
And so we're just sitting back there kind of bored. And at a certain point, he picks up the stack of albums and it's in his lap. He flipped through it and he started telling me stories about the things that he was reminded of. Oh my gosh, and I wish I could remember that. I wish I'd give anything for a tape recorder. Maybe everything's recorded in heaven. I want to play that one back. He started talking about the fact, I did takes till I was blue. I couldn't take it anymore. 4 a.m. I just got up and put on my coat and said, "Goodbye, lads. Do it tomorrow. I can't drum anymore." or the end of the Day in the Life with all of us on the 4 grand pianos, and we had to hit them at the same time, and it was a lot harder than you'd think, and just one story after another. And I looked over at a certain point. He was on my right, and I looked over, and on his left eye, a tear was coming down his cheek.
Wow.
There's a moment I'll never forget.
Unbelievable.
Yeah,
wow.
Really was.
So that was the only time you ever got one of the Beatles to be nostalgic, I take it.
Yeah, incredible. And, Ringo was just great the whole time, which is why it's so funny to me that the last song on the album is
You and Me, Babe.
Yeah. He's doing the vocal on that song. We're back in LA now. We're doing the vocal, and he'd had maybe a couple of glasses of wine, and he was feeling no pain. And it got to the ending, and that, however long that is, 40-second minute, I don't know how long it is, that whole thing of calling out everybody and thanking them, that was completely ad-libbed and not punched in. Just boom, he just started doing it. And when he got to me and he said, Bill Schnee, ever smiling, ever welcome, and goes on with the other people, I'm not saying that I was insecure or anything. I still am, by the way. I'm not saying I was insecure, but I thought for sure he said, never smiling, never welcome. Because the truth of the matter is, I don't smile a lot when I'm working. I am a little intense. People have told me I never think about it, and especially back then, I've loosened up a lot over the years. But it was about, 4 or 5 days later that I was setting up a mix or something, and I had the vocal soloed, and I heard that there was no ends on the ever and ever. And you had to be pretty insecure because Ringo would never say something like that. He was just so affable and nice.
And then you see the finished cover art. Did you recognize yourself immediately once you picked it up and scrutinized it?
The truth of the matter is, Tim Bruckner, there was some political hoo-ha about it in the beginning. I don't remember what it was. I wasn't involved in it, to be honest. But I'm sure that it probably had something to do indirectly, if not with him, about him, Klaus Voormann, who obviously is a very, very fine artist and whatnot. So I don't know what it was, but Tim Bruckner got the job. And there was, in fact, someone, I think it's online. Someone sent it to me when I was doing another interview. Somewhere there's a copy of his first idea.
Tim's or Klaus's?
Tim.
Yeah, okay, because that can be found online as well. I'll send it to you if you haven't seen it. Klaus did a draft concept of the cover, and it just was rejected.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
But then he did the wonderful pictures accompanying every song in the libretto.
Yes. And it's really sad. I went through a messy divorce in 1980, and nothing made sense in the divorce, especially the fact that she kept all the Beatle records. There was a gift, then she knew that was a gift to me from Ringo. Fortunately, they had I don't know if you've ever seen it, a special sort of silk-bound box set, very special box set, signed and numbered, which I obviously was very happy to receive one of. And she did let me have that, but whatever. And that contains lithographs of those, which are just printed, I guess, for the album. I don't remember. But Tim was actually working on that during the sessions. He was down there working on it. He called me in one day and said, look who's on the front row. And I said, oh, who's that chubby bloke? Oh, it's me, holding a reel of tape. Excellent. Thank you, Tim. And what it shows, and what he got from it, which was true, is that it was definitely a scene. Making that album became a scene. We had all these people. We had movie stars. They're obviously all friends of the Beatle, but we had all these people hanging out and whatnot. And that's what he got for the cover idea, were all these people watching Ringo, who's down on the stage in the cover, performing, and we're all there watching it.
A la Sgt. Pepper.
Yeah.
It's amazing packaging. Every bit of the album, start to finish, within the grooves as well as everything enclosing it. It's just an incredible effort. Like I said, it's monumental in his career, and something that's desperately crying out for some kind of commemorative remaster package. Now, I don't know what may exist. Maybe you've got some other cassettes that you held on to of dubs of cool stuff, but it would be wonderful to put out some kind of package of that, including the promo film. There was a promo film for Photograph I don't think a whole lot of people have seen, filmed at Tittenhurst, and whatever ancillary stuff, Klaus's preliminary drafts, but there's got to be lots of stuff that could make that a worthwhile package for sure.
Well, it's funny that you just reminded me of the fact that I was told a couple of years ago that was coming on the 50th anniversary.
Wow.
So there you have it. I don't know.
Fingers
Once
crossed,
again,
man.
not enough attention given to that record, but whatever. Because
Yeah.
I was very excited to hear that. Because like I felt, like I said earlier, I felt all along it never got the attention it deserved, and evidently it still isn't.
Yeah, well, that'd be amazing. I hope what you heard has some kind of kernel of truth to it, because it just is an obvious thing. And, we're all getting older. Come on.
Right.
So continuing down the Ringo path, now this successful, fantastic triumph for him post Beatles going into 1974. Now you got to follow it up. And again, you've got you and Richard Perry working on what became Goodnight, Vienna. You had described earlier that John did the one song for the first album. He's much more involved for this one. Want to describe that?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a sore point on several levels for me.
Uh-oh.
Okay, the first sore point is one day we're working on the album and all the highs on the left speaker went out. And so at first I thought, now, did the speaker just go bad or what? And I started doing a little checking, and I thought maybe I should clean the heads on the machine. And that's what it was. It was the oxide on analog tape in certain batches would sometimes be ill attached, so to speak, and you'd lose it. And I came to find out that that's what it was happening. We had recorded the album on bad tape, and I had two choices: to either transfer everything to another tape and go down a generation, which is not good on analog tape, or the route I chose, which was to rent a machine, the best sounding tape machine ever built, in my opinion, built by a guy named John Stevens, kind of a homemade thing. He made quite a few of them, but it was the first machine that didn't have a capstan. And for those that don't know, most tape machines have a pinch roller that pinches the tape against a capstan that's spinning, that pulls the tape from the supply reel to the take-up reel. And his machine didn't have a capstan. So it was very gentle on the tape. And that proved to work out quite well as far as that goes. I'm sure we did lose a bit over the haul of making it, but nothing like, I believe, like we would have lost by going down a generation. Mm-hmm. Harry Nilsson was very involved in that record, more involved, I guess I should say. Part of me doesn't like saying this, but part of me will go ahead and say that perhaps there were more drugs involved than in the first album.
Perhaps.
Yeah. I don't know. First of all, it was not the jovial, happy-go-lucky time that the first record was. It was a lot more, and maybe that was what you bring up. You got to follow it, which often happens, with artists. The first successful, doesn't have to be their first album, but the first successful album, now you got to follow it up with some more success. And did that put too much pressure? I guess it would be Richard would have taken the lion's share of that, because Ringo, he was definitely involved, but in a way, he was along for the ride on both albums. Mm. So he would definitely have opinions, but obviously Richard was guiding the ship. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, but it just wasn't the same happy-go-lucky kind of time. We still had lots of great people on it. Elton John wrote a song for him. It was the same kind of idea, but somehow didn't work quite as well. Now,
John was separated from Yoko during this time. I don't know if you'd met her during the Ringo sessions, if she'd showed up for the session or not.
No,
anything you can speak to?
She did not. But what's her name?
May Pang?
Yeah.
Yeah, she would have been around for Goodnight Vienna for sure.
Yes, she was there quite a bit. Mm-hmm. And we still talk on Facebook. Mm-hmm. Funny enough.
And also, Ringo's marriage to Maureen would have broken down by this time, because Nancy Andrews was on the scene as well.
Yeah, it was broken on the first album, wasn't it?
Well, 73, I'm not sure how much they were still together. You still see pictures of them as a couple, but the marriage didn't officially end till 75. But
okay.
By that time in 74, Nancy was very definitely around.
Yeah, I might be conflating those two. I just remember when there was trouble in River City.
Right. But John, separated from Yoko, I think couldn't help but make his availability be that much more for the second album. And then he writes the title tune to it as well. You describe in the book that there's another one of these sort of serendipitous things, him strumming away on his acoustic guitar and starts playing the Platters' Only You, and just sort of casually calls out, "Hey, Ring, this would be a good one for you." Do you remember that moment?
Yeah. That was exactly what it was. He was just sitting there in that guitar booth in Sunset Sound, strumming away, and all of a sudden he started singing it. I can't say for sure. Did he say that or did Richard? I don't know. But there again, that's another Richard song because Richard was in a doo-wop group himself called the Escorts. Right. He was a big fan of that ilk.
And we do have, of course, the run through with John's lead vocal. Was that something you had anything to do with keeping that on tape?
That one did not come from me like the other one did.
Uh-huh.
That came from, undoubtedly, I find these things out years later, from second engineers that aren't supposed to do things when everyone leaves, but inevitably they all do. It's kind of funny. The tracks from Asia, from Steely Dan's Asia, I never kept them. When I was doing the record every day, I'd pop a cassette in my car and listen to what we had done and be just blown away with how incredible the music was. But I never heard the tracks again for decades. And then I ran across one of the second engineers that was on the session, and he said, "Oh, yeah, I might have a few of those." and indeed he did. And then it's like, unfortunately, he didn't have all of them, darn it.
Mm-hmm.
But whatever.
Yeah. Well, thank God for these people that do this stuff.
Yeah, second engineers, I'll tell you. And of course, when they say second engineer, you have to think about jumping again to Steely Dan, to the poor guy that, about the song on Gaucho that got erased?
Yeah, remind me of that. What was that?
Well, that album was kind of rough going for them. Walter got hit by a taxi crossing the street in New York, and his girlfriend overdosed and whatnot. And a song that Donald absolutely loved to pieces got erased. And when he got to the studio and they told him, he didn't respond. He just turned around and walked out for the day. And later in an interview, he said that was the worst day in his recording career.
Wow.
And they tried to re-record it and felt that they never got back to what it once was, which is very unfortunate. So some guys in Nashville decided that they should record the song. There's a version online. It's called The Second Arrangement. There's a version online, but it's from a cassette and it's really wobbly and it's not good, but good enough to get the song eked out. So the bunch of guys got together and put it together, and they got Michael O'Mardian, who was big on Steely Dan records, to play the piano on it. And the guy that started this whole thing, Scott Sheriff, he played the electric piano. And they put it all together and called me and said, "Would you mix this?" They sent it to me and I loved it. And so I mixed it. And I think it came out great. And I think it's one of the best Steely Dan songs on the commercial side of things. It's really good. And unfortunate that they never got a tape they thought was as good. But they were so plagued with problems. It's kind of funny. The Third World Man on that record is a leftover song from my album, from Asia. And it was a Steve Gadd song. We cut 4 songs with Steve Gadd, and only the title song, Asia, made the record. But they were so frustrated with how things were going, and there's still only 7 or 8 songs on that record, that they pulled out a track from Asia and finished it up for another song on the album. And it's kind of funny, when it won the Grammy that year for Best Engineered Album. And when I went up with the guys, I said, "Can I speak first?" And they said, "Sure." And I turned to the guys on the mic and I said, "Guys, this is kind of silly. I'm really just along for the ride on this one." And Elliot Shiner, that did a lot of the recording and did almost all the mixing, said, "Are you kidding? If we didn't have that song, we'd still be making the record." and he was probably right. But things like that just happen. Anyway, the second arrangement. So I have a guy that I barely know. It's someone that read the book and wrote me an email to tell me how much he liked the book. And I get another email from him right after I finished mixing the second arrangement. And he says, "There was an interview with Donald Fagen, and he says nice things about you." And I said, "So I sent you a link." So I listened to the link, and he gets down to it, and the interviewer mentions my name, and Donald says, "Oh, how is Bill?" And he says, "He's doing good." And Donald says, "He's the best recording engineer we ever used."
Wow.
And talk about moments that you won't forget, that made my little heart jump up and down. And right then I said, okay, he's got to hear this. So I called his drummer that I know, and I said, "I need to get a hold of Donald." And he gave me his email address. So I wrote him and told him what had happened. And I said, I'm sending this to you. I hope it doesn't bring back too many bad memories. And he said, he didn't respond. And so, oh, whatever. That afternoon, I'm watching a movie, and all of a sudden it dawns on me. I totally freaked. It's never been released. We can't put it out. We can't do anything with it. So I picked up my phone and I emailed him again. And I said, "I just realized that you never released this song. And so we can't do anything with it." And he wrote right back and he said, "Good to hear from you, Bill. The song sounds great. Whoever did it, go ahead and release it." So It should be, I don't know, they're working on figuring a way to do something with it, but it came out really, really good.
That's fantastic.
I think what's happening is they're going to approach Donald to see if he would sing it. And I don't want any part of that. I'm 99% sure he won't do it, but it needs to be heard in any event. I mean, it's so Steely Dan, and like I said, so commercial, so good.
Wow. What a great story. That's unbelievable. So any final thoughts on Goodnight Vienna?
No.
What's conspicuous about that album is no involvement from Paul or George. Was that anything you were conscious of at the time?
Yes, very. Because we were all disappointed. Richard and I were very disappointed. They were working on solo records, and that was that. So, yeah.
Well, I guess John made up for it in his way.
Yeah, but whatever. Unfortunately, it wasn't the album that Ringo was.
No.
Still pretty good, but...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
The Nilsson song he does on there, Easy For Me, I think is terrific.
Yeah.
That's one I wish more people heard.
Yeah. Yeah. But what a talent that guy was. That's one of the saddest things to me. These people that we've lost because of drugs, stupid partying all the time and stuff, because that guy was incredibly brilliant. Every time I worked with him, my jaw would hang down, especially like vocals and stuff. He could just put harmonies together on the spot that were just gorgeous.
You'd worked on Nilsson Schmilsson?
No. Son of, I did.
Son of Schmilsson.
Not worth talking about, really, but yeah.
Okay. You don't like the album, or
no. Well, I don't like the album as much as Nilsson Schmilsson.
Sure.
As much. Same kind of thing, really, if you ask me. The sophomore album of the hit album, and it's there again. He just got more and more out. Songs like "You're Breaking My Heart," give me a break. And he takes a bunch of people from an old folks' home to sing the chorus. I mean, he was a dark guy at sometimes with the drugs.
Well, gave you plenty of stories.
Yes, sir.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of stories, this book is just unbelievable in terms of the ground covered. We've scratched a very narrow niche of Beatle world in here, but my God, the stories you had starting with Streisand, who was just a gem to work with, as you describe. Talk about your friendship with Boz Scaggs.
Yeah. And by the way, I don't know if I wrote it in the book, but I'm one of the only people I've ever met. I hope there's more out there, but I'm one of the only people I've ever met that doesn't have a bad word to say about her, because, I haven't worked with her now in probably 10 years, 12 years, but every time I've worked with her, it's just been great. And she is very demanding and so on and so on and so on, but I never had any problem with her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was actually kind of refreshing to read what you wrote about her in there, because people have a perception of her being difficult and such.
Yeah, but and I think she is, but I just, maybe dumb luck on my part. I don't know.
You hit it off, yeah. George Martin, did you have any dealings with him?
The only dealings I had was I mixed several albums for Mark Knopfler, and we mixed at Air, and he would be there once in a while. So it was just completely casual.
Yeah, not a working relationship.
And I did the Last Dire Straits album there, too, on Every Street. And so, he would just pop in every once in a while to say hello.
Any small talk? Any career talk?
No.
Or just hi, goodbye kind of stuff? Okay.
No, not really.
That's the studio that got wiped out?
No, that's the one that moved to a church. He lost his lease, and he moved it to a church before he got out of it. That one was down in the Bahamas.
Yeah, Montserrat?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Had you ever worked there?
Unfortunately, no. I would like to have seen it, for sure.
Something About the Beatles, created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez, sponsored by BetterHelp. Go to betterhelp.com/satbeat for 10% off your first month. Executive producer Rick Way. Title song by the Corgis.